I thought it was a romance. Turns out it's a manual on how to raise a maniac. Now my brain won't stop screaming, "Help! This psycho is way too good at love."
Trapped in the Phantom of the Opera, Episode 8. For a moment, Flora thought she'd arrived early to heaven. She saw Miss Clement, dead for 3 years, standing there, alive. But then, she noticed the subtle differences. Miss Clement had auburn hair, while this woman had rich dark black hair. Her skin wasn't ghostly pale like Miss Clement's, but a vibrant lily-white glow of life. And yet, her eyes were identical, sharp and sly, like a wildcat ready to pounce. Flora murmured, "God above." "Miss Clement, is it really you?" Polly smiled and said, "Where's Maribel?" At that, Flora gasped, tears welling up instantly. "Miss Clement, it is you. I missed you so much." She threw herself into Polly's arms like a little girl finally seeing her parent again and burst into tears. The staff nearby stared in stunned silence. He had no idea who Polly Clement was, only that her name was strictly forbidden inside the opera house. 6 months ago, a male actor had been reading a newspaper in the break room when he suddenly laughed. "Look at this woman, gathering a bunch of freaks and hiding them in a haunted house to scare people. What a joke. And she even made money doing it. People in New York are calling her a businesswoman." Someone casually chimed in, maybe there was more to it than just jump scares. The actor gave a lewd laugh. Of course there was. Who the hell pays money to get scared on purpose? I bet she was really running a brothel. This kind of trash talk was common in the break room. Usually it passed with a laugh. But that night, while performing a ballet interlude, that very actor slipped and fell during a jump. The stage had suddenly become slick, like it was covered in oil. He leapt beautifully. Limbs extended midair. Then, crack. He landed hard, broke his spine, never woke up again. The stage crew later said his neck snapped in such a grotesque way that part of his spine poked right out. The scene was horrifying. After that, similar accidents began to happen, each one tied to someone who had spoken ill of Polly Clement. Some whispered she was the opera ghost's wife, and insulting her was asking for the ghost's wrath. From that point on, her name became taboo in the opera house. Flora, one of the few people who could speak to the ghost, definitely knew about that taboo. And yet, she called this woman Miss Clement. But Polly Clement had been dead for 3 years. So, was this woman not among the living? A ghost? The staffer turned pale and backed away in fear, hair standing on end. Murmurs rose through the grand hall. Dozens of curious eyes turned toward them. Flora quickly wiped her tears and said, "Miss Clement, there's no time. The masquerade is about to start." Polly asked curiously, "What's this masquerade for? And where's Erik?" At the mention of his name, Flora trembled. "I don't know. No one knows where he is or what he wants." Just thinking about it made her shiver. "You have no idea. After you left, he completely lost his mind. He lived with your corpse for half a year." Then she remembered that corpse had been Polly herself and quickly stammered, I'm sorry, Miss Clement." Polly waved it off gently. "It's okay. I know." Flora looked at her with wide eyes, wanting to ask, "Aren't you afraid?" But she swallowed the question, just as Erik had shown such strange devotion to her body, believing her soul would return. Polly also didn't fear his madness. Flora had always been afraid of Erik, and that fear would probably never fade. But even she had to admit, he and Miss Clement were born for each other. Polly said, "Let's head inside." Her calmness steadied Flora. She took a deep breath, grabbed Polly's hand, and led her into the hall. Just then, all the lights went out. The grand, gilded hall plunged into darkness. A low buzz of panic rippled through the crowd, like a hive of frightened bees. In the dark, Flora's trembling voice whispered in Polly's ear, "He's here. He's coming." Polly looked toward the grand staircase. For a second, she couldn't hear anything, just the deafening thump of blood pounding in her ears. The dim light showed only a silhouette, a towering figure standing at the top of the stairs. And then, a familiar cold voice cut through the silence. "Good evening, everyone. Erik." It had been too long since Polly last heard that voice. Her ears burned with heat. Her heart slammed into her throat. Without thinking, she began pushing through the crowd toward him. "I invited you here." Erik's voice sounded cold and weary, not for a masquerade, but to confirm something As she moved forward, others jostled and pushed too. Erik's cryptic words had stirred up agitation. Before Polly could reach him, the crowd shoved her back to her original spot. Someone shouted angrily, "Ghost, how long are you going to keep playing games? Go ahead, kill us all." Erik chuckled faintly. "Mr. DeRosier, do you think I can't recognize you just because the lights are off? If you're so eager to die with me, allow me to oblige. Tell me, does your wife know that you sold off your inheritance for your mistress?" Gasps exploded. The DeRosier family wasn't ancient, but they had deep ties with noble families, especially the illustrious La Rochefoucauld line. Who would have guessed this social climber had sold his family land to please a mistress? What a disgrace to his wife. Suddenly, everyone in the room clammed up, too afraid to speak, terrified their own dirty secrets might be exposed next. Even DeRosier, who moments earlier had dared to defy Erik, turned purple and collapsed onto the floor. Erik's face showed no emotion. Exposing these nobles brought him no joy, only disgust. He was about to continue when he suddenly spotted something in the crowd. Her. Polly. After 2 years, the hallucination had returned. There she was, pushing through the crowd, staggering toward him. This vision felt more real, more vivid than ever before. She wasn't avoiding him like in past illusions. She was moving toward him. Erik stared, greed and hunger filling his gaze. He had thought that if he just followed the plot, she would return. Even now, Christine Daae and Raoul de Chagny were married. Yet Polly had not come back. It was clear now, she didn't want to return. Realizing that brought him eerie calm. For the past 3 years, day after day, he had been tormented by a monstrous craving, longing to open his eyes and see her beside him. But all he ever saw were illusions, and illusions only deepened the ache. Eventually, he stopped sleeping altogether, terrified he'd miss the moment her soul returned. He knew better than anyone, if this went on, he would lose his mind. Sometimes he even thought, maybe it was better she didn't come back. Because if she did, he wasn't sure what his maddened self might do to her. But perhaps he had overestimated himself. Eventually, the longing broke him. One day, staring at her notebook, he thought with chilling calm, if he was just a character in a film, and the story was built around the opera house, then maybe destroying it, along with all of France's nobility, would transport him to her world. Yes, maybe it would be too late. Maybe she had already returned while he was still preparing the explosion. But he didn't care anymore. An addict's nerves are thin as spider silk, always on the verge of snapping. 3 years of waiting was already more than most could survive. When Polly chose to stay in the modern world, she should have known he would lose his mind for her. Erik stood silent for a long time. Someone in the crowd finally asked, "What is it you're trying to confirm?" Erik's voice was chilling, almost deranged. "If I detonate the explosives under the opera house, will I finally see her again?" The air froze. No one could believe what they just heard. A wave of gasps swept the hall. They had assumed the ghost invited them here for blackmail. They were nobles, almost all with ties to the French royal family. Bloodlines tangled like spiderwebs. Who would have guessed? The ghost didn't want money. He wanted to kill them all. In the rising panic, someone stammered, "Isn't there a lake under the opera house? Did you hide explosives in that?" Another voice shouted, "If it's money you want, just say it." But Erik's tone was indifferent. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not asking for your opinion. I'm informing you." Polly had been trying to push through the crowd but got nowhere. She had hoped to see what Erik planned. But this was far worse than she imagined. He really intended to blow up the Paris Opera House. Unbelievable. The room was pitch black, the crowd's panic deafening. She shouted Erik's name as she shoved her way forward, but her voice was drowned in the chaos. Still, she knew he would hear her. This was a man who could detect the pressure of a pianist's keystrokes within an orchestra. Of course he would hear her. Erik stared at Polly, eyes burning, his vision blurred. His chest ached. This hallucination was uncanny. He could even hear her voice. She was calling his name. Would she walk up to him next? At that moment, Polly finally broke through the crowd, gripping the stair railing. Step by step, she climbed toward him. She had dreamed of this scene every night during her month at sea. But in her dreams, the floor always crumbled, her steps collapsing under her weight. Now, she was really walking toward him. He stood in the darkness, watching her with a gaze so hungry, so euphoric, his breath came fast and heavy. It wasn't breathing anymore. It was the eerie tremor of bones. Under his searing stare, Polly's heart raced too. The air felt like a balloon, stretched to the breaking point. She hardly dared to breathe. Then she reached him, extended her hand. Her voice was hoarse. "Erik, I'm back." He stared at her outstretched hand. A strange smile crept onto his face. "I know. Once I set off the explosives, I'll come find you." Polly sighed, stepped closer, slipped her arms around his neck, and whispered, just before kissing him, "You can't blow up the opera house, because I'm not ready to die." A soft warmth brushed against his lips. Her hot breath moistened the tip of his nose. Erik stared fixedly at Polly, utterly unable to distinguish whether this was real or just another hallucination. A starving man, even when tasting the delicacy he longed for, may lose the ability to tell if it's real. It wasn't until Polly wrapped her arms around his neck, gently pried open his lips, and touched the tip of his tongue with hers, until he reflexively swallowed a mouthful of her saliva, that he suddenly realized she was real, not an illusion. In that moment, the ecstasy of regaining what he had lost surged through his body, blanking his mind in a roaring rush. By the time he came to his senses, he had already gripped the back of her head and was kissing her back, deep, hungry, nearly feral, sucking desperately on her tongue. Polly let out a small yelp of pain, but that sound only made his kisses more feverish, more urgent. He sucked until the root of her tongue ached, her mouth overflowing with saliva. Then came the sound of a loud swallow. Erik, still gazing into her eyes, pressed his lips to hers and swallowed the mouthful of mixed saliva that had overflowed. Polly felt her ears go hot, not because he had swallowed her saliva, but because the entire time he did it, he was breathing, low and heavy, his chest vibrating against hers, making her scalp tingle. His voice had always been seductive, but after 3 years, it had grown hauntingly beautiful, almost unnaturally so. Polly felt her entire body go weak, like her bones had turned to water. She nearly slipped down the stairs. Erik caught her waist instantly and pressed her back into place. Polly let out a relieved breath. She was just about to tease him when she felt a wave of hot air brush past her ear. His nose pressed against the side of her neck as he said, word by word, "You're real. You're not a hallucination." Her heart throbbed painfully at his words. "Yeah, I'm really back." Erik closed his eyes and buried his face into the crook of her neck, breathing in her scent deeply. Only then did he notice she was wearing his shirt and coat. She had worn them so long, she was nearly soaked in his scent. And his hollow heart, long starved, finally felt a trace of fulfillment. But that feeling didn't last. In its place surged a crushing wave of panic. She was back. But for how long? Last time, she had disappeared for 3 years. What about next time? 5 years? 10? 20? Or never again? And the worst part, he had nearly detonated the explosives under Paris. If she had arrived a moment later, he would have never seen her again. He might have blown her up with the opera house. The thought gripped him so fiercely that he could almost see the image of her body shattered to pieces, and his chest began to heave. Polly couldn't see his expression, only heard his breathing grow heavy and ragged. She thought it was just the intensity of the moment. She hugged him and whispered comfortingly, "It's okay. I'm back now. I won't leave again. I was only gone for a little over a month where I was. The time flows differently between our worlds. That's why it felt like 3 years here." He seemed to calm down a little. "Time flow? I'm not sure how to explain it," Polly said. "Time isn't fixed. It's affected by gravity and velocity. 2 overlapping timelines is already an abnormal phenomenon. It's natural that time flows differently. Still," her voice caught as her nose stung, "I didn't think you'd wait for me for 3 years." Her nose tingled. Erik must have sensed the emotion in her voice. He kissed her nose, then her throat. Polly had always taken a quiet satisfaction in her ability to calm him down, but she'd never realized it went both ways. He could soothe her too, and in that moment, she felt it was all worth it. The month at sea, the 4-hour train ride, everything. Just to be by his side again. It was truly worth it. She rose on tiptoe, wanting to kiss his throat in return. But he held her jaw, pushing her back slightly to steady her face in the dark. "You really won't leave again?" Polly blinked. "I really won't." Erik didn't respond. He gently brushed her cheek with his thumb. lost in thought. The next moment, all the lights snapped on. Erik abruptly pulled her face against his chest, shielding her from the crowd below. Polly jumped. So did the nobles and ladies in the hall, staring at them in shock. It was then that Polly noticed Erik looked entirely different than usual. He wore a bone-white skull mask. Not his usual black, but a dangerous, vivid red. In the book of Isaiah, red symbolizes sin. If she hadn't arrived in time, he would have committed mass slaughter. Polly couldn't help but grab his hand and press a kiss to his palm. Erik looked down at her, and Polly felt a chill. After 3 years, his eyes had changed, like a madman's. The rims were red, crisscrossed with bloodshot veins, yet his voice was calm. My apologies, everyone. What I said just now was only a joke. Please, enjoy the ball. The lie was flimsy, but no one challenged it. The ghost knew too much. No one dared confront him directly. But in the shadows, several nobles exchanged glances, reaching a silent agreement. After the masquerade, they would thoroughly investigate the opera house. These were the descendants of royalty. Their pride was sacred. They would not forgive this ghost who humiliated them. Polly didn't see those glances, but she knew. They would seek revenge. Tonight, Erik's every word and action had been a slap in the face to every noble in France. But it didn't matter. Polly thought optimistically they could leave Paris, start over somewhere else. Just then, Erik gently lifted her chin, staring into her eyes, and said out of nowhere, "Close your eyes. I'm taking you somewhere." Polly tried to lighten the mood. "Okay, but you have to promise me one thing." The moment the words left her mouth, Erik's grip on her chin tightened, brutally. She yelped, slapped his hand away, and covered her cheek. Ow, that hurt. He didn't flinch. "What thing?" "It's been so long. I just want you to kiss me again," Polly grumbled, still rubbing her face. "What's with the brute strength?" Erik didn't answer. After a long pause, he bent down and kissed her lips. "I'm sorry." He didn't tell her that in the few dreams where she reappeared, every time she said, "Promise me one thing," she left. Without hesitation, he was like a frightened animal now. Every vague sentence triggered memories of a nightmare ending. Polly closed her eyes obediently after the kiss. Erik stared at her for a moment. Then he slipped one arm under her back, the other beneath her knees, and lifted her off the ground. His breathing was frantic, chaotic, erratic, like a machine pushed beyond its limit. Polly felt his pulse hammering. It made her skin crawl. It wasn't a heartbeat. It was the tremble of a sick soul. She asked twice if she could open her eyes. The answer was no both times. His body was too warm. His arms too steady. Polly rested her head on his shoulder and eventually drifted off. But it wasn't a restful sleep. Even with her eyes closed, she could sense light flickering around her, an eerie, shifting glow. Halfway through, Erik adjusted his grip, one hand under her rear, the other on her back, cradling her like a child. Like this, how was she supposed to sleep? But her eyelids felt glued shut. She couldn't keep them open. Then came the sense of weightlessness, again and again. Erik was descending stairs. At first, just a few steps. Then longer, deeper, more endless, like a staircase into a nightmare. Downward. Always downward. Into a dark, terrifying nest. Polly tried more than once to open her eyes, but the rhythmic footsteps lulled her back to sleep. Half conscious, she wondered, is he taking me to the underground labyrinth? After all, he'd had 2 years. Plenty of time to build a lakefront dwelling like the one in the novel. But why wouldn't he let her open her eyes? Her mind was clear, but her eyes refused to open. That could only mean one thing. He wouldn't let her. Why? She didn't know how much time passed. When she finally could open her eyes, she was lying in a wooden boat. Erik's deep red coat was draped over her. Before her stretched a shadowy lake, dark green and ominous, like a poisonous plant. Erik sat beside her, rowing with slow, deliberate strokes, heading toward the center of the lake. When he saw her awake, he reached out to feel her forehead. "We're almost there," he said softly. Polly didn't ask where he was taking her. She just lay back down. 2 minutes later, the boat bumped into the shore with a dull thud. Just as she was about to rise, Erik scooped her up and set her on the ground. She looked around and joked, "So, this is your hometown, huh?" Erik stepped off the boat, his voice unreadable. "You knew I'd bring you here?" Polly didn't want to lie. After a second's hesitation, she answered honestly, "You know, I'm not from this era. The reason I ended up here is because of a horror movie. Even though he already knew, saying it out loud felt cruel. And you were the star of that film. Erik's voice was much calmer than she expected. I know. The movie was adapted from a novel that detailed your entire life. I know. Polly continued, with difficulty. It said you once traveled all across Europe, built a mechanical palace for the Shah of Persia, and learned a rope trick in India called Punjab lasso, he said. Right. But the novel's plot differs from the horror film, Polly added, trying to sound light. In the book, you were invited by Garnier to help with the Opera House's foundation. You built a lakeside home underground to isolate yourself from the world. But now, I don't know why you built this place. He looked at her, then smiled faintly. To keep you here, Polly froze. I read a lot during your absence, he said quietly. Even exchanged letters with that Mr. Tesla of yours for a while. What do you mean, her Mr. Tesla? Polly almost laughed. She was about to respond when Erik lifted a finger and pressed it gently to her lips. In the dark, she couldn't see his expression, but she could feel the weight of his gaze. It was heavy and murky, like an iron shackle clamped around her throat. I regret to say, Erik murmured, Mr. Tesla didn't know how to travel through time either, but he did give me some useful ideas on how to prevent you from disappearing again. Polly's breath caught. In the darkness, Erik suddenly grabbed her wrist and pulled her closer. In the dim light, she could finally see his eyes. They shimmered in eerie gold, no longer human, filled with restless excitement, euphoria, and bottomless fear. This house, he said, was built to stop you from ever disappearing again. Polly was utterly stunned. Tesla really did believe that time and space might be affected by strong magnetic fields. He was once struck by a 3.5 million volt current during an experiment and claimed to have seen the past, present, and future in that instant. The incident was widely reported in the media and became one of the so-called proofs of his time travel experiments. Polly had always thought that was a conspiracy theory. She never expected it would line up so well with her own experience. Wild. But as fascinating as Tesla was, she was even more curious about the structure of this lakeside mansion. She tugged Erik's hand and smiled. Well, what are we waiting for? Show me around. Erik stared at her for a long moment before walking ahead and pressing a hidden mechanism. Ever since she came back, he often looked at her with that same eerie gaze, something sticky, bordering on hunger, like he wanted to swallow her whole. Polly didn't really mind. She gave him a quick kiss and urged him to lead the way. The structure of the mansion was indeed unique. It was built between the two thick foundation walls of the Opera House. Each of those protective walls was absurdly strong, composed of a cofferdam-like barrier, a brick wall, a thick layer of cement, and another several-meter-thick wall. The lake itself surrounded all four sides, forming a natural barrier. At night, dense fog would rise over the water, making it impossible to see the opposite shore. Unless someone knew the exact route like Erik, even with a boat, they wouldn't make it across. Polly kind of liked that feeling. It was like a hidden base in the mountains during a blizzard. A cliffside glass villa. A secret bunker in a backyard garden. This kind of isolation thrilled her. As they stepped inside, the first thing she saw was a long stone corridor. Silver sconces were spaced every 2 meters along the walls, each holding a candle. The flickering candlelight cast a warm and dreamy glow across the corridor. Erik held her hand in one of his, and in the other he lifted a lantern from the wall and led the way. The hallway was wide enough. Polly took a few steps forward, wanting to walk beside him. Suddenly, he grabbed her back and pinned her against his chest, giving her waist a light but firm slap. Don't move. That move was exactly what Polly had in mind anyway. She blinked and obediently stood still. After the corridor, they entered the living room. Polly was shocked. The entire layout was almost identical to the villa in New Orleans. 3 sides of towering floor-to-ceiling windows. Heavy red velvet curtains, a chandelier hanging from the ceiling casting dazzling light, and a grand piano against the wall. On the music stand was an open score, but it held no musical notes, only portraits of her, drawings of her in every expression and pose. Polly stood frozen. That familiar ache welled up in her chest, threatening to burst from her nose. Her voice turned hoarse. Can I look at that music book? Erik didn't answer. See the bedroom first. Polly didn't care whether she saw the bedroom first or last, so she nodded. Another hallway later, they entered the bedroom. Oddly enough, there were two. One was a near-perfect replica of her old room in New Orleans. Even the fireplace was positioned exactly the same, though without a chimney, it was purely decorative. She opened the closet. It was filled with brand new clothes. She held one up to herself. Definitely too short. Such a waste, she muttered. So many gorgeous outfits. I'll make more, he replied. Apparently, Erik didn't like her wearing anything made by other tailors. She wondered if he ever came back to the modern world and saw her full wardrobe. What would he think? But she didn't dare say that out loud. His current mental state was far too unstable. Even a joke about the modern world might send him spiraling. Next to her closet was a door. Behind it, his bedroom. Polly stepped in and froze, eyes wide. It didn't look like a bedroom. It looked like a tomb. It had the same decor as the reception room, but instead of curtains on the tall windows, there were heavy black drapes. Almost no furniture. In the center of the room sat a white wooden coffin, lid open, draped with deep crimson velvet canopy. Polly felt a crushing weight press against her chest. In the original novel, Erik did sleep in a coffin, but reading about it and seeing it with her own eyes were two very different things. She thought she'd changed him, but in the end, he still returned to the opera house basement. Still lay in that coffin. Her heart ached. "Why are you sleeping in that thing?" He looked at her, then spoke. "Because of you." She blinked. The room had no electric lights. No candles either. She couldn't see his face clearly, only his golden eyes glowing faintly. They reminded her of a wild animal on the brink of insanity, eyes alight with manic hunger. "For the past 3 years," he said, "I could only sleep when I lay in that coffin." Suddenly, he raised a hand and gripped her chin, thumb pressing against her carotid artery, like he was confirming she was alive. "If you hadn't told me to wait for you, I would have been buried with you the day you died." Polly stopped breathing. As he felt the pulse beneath his thumb, his hand trembled slightly, like he was waking from a nightmare, reminded he was still alive. Since her death, he hadn't truly felt alive at all. But now she was back. And not only was his mind waking up, his desire was too. A frenzied desire he hadn't felt in years. Just the thought of her living here with him forever, never escaping, made his entire body tremble with excitement. She had no idea what he was thinking. She probably assumed she was just here for a visit. She didn't even know that after she died, he dug up her grave, opened her coffin, and lived with her corpse for over half a year. At that moment, Polly let out a soft sigh. Erik's gaze grew cold. What was she sighing for? Had she realized who he truly was? Was she already planning how to leave? Then he heard her voice, low and exasperated. "So, you really dug up my grave and spent months with my corpse?" Erik's head jerked downward, stunned. Polly wrapped her arms around his neck, reached up, removed his skull mask, and kissed his lips. "Idiot. You know that stuff made headlines, right? Everyone was speculating about who hated me enough to dig up my grave. But the moment I saw the story, I knew it was you." He stared at her, eyes more fevered than ever, blazing golden fire nearly burning her skin. "You're not mad at me?" His voice shook with excitement. So much so, he couldn't control the muscles in his face. A weird, twitchy expression flickered across him. Distorted, frightening. But while anyone else would have been terrified, Polly wasn't. She kissed him again. "Why would I be mad at you? If it had been you lying in that coffin, I'd probably have done the same thing." Erik's heart had never pounded so hard. His temples throbbed. His blood boiled. For a moment, he genuinely wondered, am I dreaming again? If this wasn't a dream, why had she come back? Why was she being so gentle? Grave desecration was a serious offense. Every religion condemned it. Yet she had said it so casually. Even in her notebook, he had always been portrayed as a pathetic, vile, repulsive man. From the start, she had known how twisted and terrifying he was, knew his hideous past, knew that once he loved someone, he would never let go. And yet, she still fell for him. She even gave up her modern life to return to him. If this isn't a dream, how could someone like him deserve something so wonderful? The thought made his head spin. Heat surged through his body. A dangerous thought crept into his mind. He wanted to test her. How far could her acceptance go? What if he told her everything, laid bare the darkest, most twisted corners of his soul? Would she still stay? He lowered his head and pressed his forehead to hers, stared directly into her eyes. Tell me, if you die, and I stitch your body onto mine, will we be together in the next life? Polly? Huh? Polly held back and held back, but in the end, she couldn't resist. Get lost. Instead of being angry, Erik actually looked more excited after being scolded. A strange, intense, and unsettling joy shone in his eyes, and his chest heaved even harder. Even if he didn't say a word, Polly could already guess what was going on in his mind, let alone now that he'd said so much nonsense. It was obvious. He was testing her, probing for her limits, making up scenarios in that twisted little head of his. There was only one way to deal with him at times like this. Polly raised her hand and gave him a light slap. Cut the crap. If you want to live with me, this coffin's gotta go. Sure enough, after the slap, he looked slightly more normal. He lowered his head into her palm and took a deep breath of her scent. In the 3 years she'd been gone, he seemed to have grown taller again. He had to stoop slightly to bury his face in her hand. And that was even though Polly herself was now 10 centimeters taller than before. She didn't even dare ask how tall he was now. Back when she left, he had already hit 6'5". What if he'd grown another inch? Most people would kill to grow another centimeter. But him? He had somehow grown an extra inch on top of 6 feet 5 inches. Polly really wished that inch had been given to her instead. Then maybe the size difference between them wouldn't feel so ridiculous. The coffin was too large to throw out immediately. So Polly ordered him to lock the bedroom door and forbid himself from opening it again until the coffin was gone. Erik agreed without a word of protest. Once the coffin was out of sight, Polly felt a lot better and settled in at the lakeside mansion with no hesitation. She'd never been much of a social person anyway. Every time she saw those stay-home challenge videos online, stay indoors for 100 days and win $100,000, she always wondered where to sign up. Even when she traveled, she mostly holed up in hotels. Just thinking about needing to go outside to see sights made her lose interest in the scenery. Case in point, she lived in New Orleans for ages and never once considered visiting nearby cities. She'd known that Edison and Tesla were feuding in New York and still never felt like going to see it firsthand. Why? She just wasn't interested. Polly figured it probably stemmed from childhood. Her parents would often go on trips and leave her behind. As a result, she developed a deep resistance to travel. Later, when she got a little older and finally started to feel curious about travel, her parents sent her off to stay with relatives in the US. After that, she developed a full-on aversion to unfamiliar places and cultures. Over the next 2 days, Polly familiarized herself with the layout of the underground mansion. Aside from the living room, bedrooms, bathroom, and a small garden, there was also a massive music room. The moment she stepped in, she was stunned. A full-size pipe organ loomed against one entire wall, majestic and grand like a cathedral. It had 4 rows of keys and over 1,000 pipes. Polly had only ever seen pipe organs of this scale in churches. When played, the sound could resonate throughout an entire town. She herself had learned piano, and just handling 1 row of keys already felt like her hands and brain were overwhelmed. She couldn't begin to imagine what it took to play an organ like this, both hands weaving across 4 rows of keys, while also managing the pedal board with her feet and adjusting the stops to change tonal colors. For reference, the pedal board alone had 32 keys, not the usual 3 pedals you find on a piano. A master organist could change the stops mid-performance and produce music more layered and complex than a full orchestra. To Polly, it seemed almost inhuman. That evening, after dinner, Polly stopped Erik mid-dishwashing. She wrapped her arms around his neck and perched on his lap. Dishes can wait. I want to hear you play the organ. Since it was just the 2 of them, Erik didn't wear his mask anymore. Still, old habits die hard. He turned his face to avoid her gaze. Why? Polly fluttered her lashes and said sweetly, "Because I want to hear my husband play." Is that not allowed? That line worked like a charm. He stared at her for a moment and nodded. Polly had also noticed that, in addition to going maskless, Erik's clothing had grown more relaxed. He rarely wore gloves anymore, and his white shirt was often unbuttoned at the top, revealing a glimpse of his toned chest. The thought that all these changes were because of her gave her a strange, thrilling rush. Erik stepped into the music room and sat before the organ, adjusting the volume to the lowest setting. Though the room was enormous by normal standards, it was still small compared to a church. If he played at full volume in a space like this, they'd risk going deaf. Polly sat beside him, chin propped on her hand, watching him adjust the stops. Suddenly, Erik asked, "The organ will sound pretty quiet. Are you sure you want to listen?" Polly hesitated for a second, thinking something felt off. Erik didn't know she could play piano. He didn't know she could sing either. He probably assumed she knew nothing about music, so he likely didn't realize. She knew exactly what those stops did. She knew they didn't just change the tone, they also adjusted the volume. She knew him too well. A moment of thought and it clicked. Was this psycho worried she'd use the organ to send signals to the surface by blasting music at full volume? She nearly laughed. Out loud, she just said calmly, "Of course." Erik placed his hands on the keys. He pressed one note, then another, and then he began to play, improvising. With the volume turned low, the organ didn't roar like thunder. Instead, the sound was soft, delicate, like a flute. It still retained the organ's signature grandeur, but with a gentler, luminous edge. The piece began with a sense of tension, like storm clouds rolling in, dark and oppressive. One hand kept repeating two simple notes, while the other adjusted the stops and laid down a haunting accompaniment. Despite the minimal beginning, the music grew richer and more layered by the second, like a burning town lighting up a midnight sky. Then, suddenly, he adjusted a stop, and the organ sang like a harp, a new light. The darkness cracked open. Polly remembered something her piano teacher once said: "Just placing your fingers on the right keys doesn't mean you know how to play. True performance is an act of recreation. The way you press each note, the pressure, the timing, carries emotional depth machines can't replicate." Even though pipe organ volume wasn't affected by pressure, Polly could still hear the nuance in Erik's dynamic control. His mastery over timbre and tonal layering was breathtaking. She looked at him. His head was lowered in focus, shoulders relaxed, arms and wrists flowing with effortless grace. The music didn't feel like it was played with fingers. It felt like it poured from his blood. By the end, the melody slowed, softened, warm, intimate, almost sensual. It felt like sunlight rippling on the ocean. So hot her face flushed, her head dizzy. When the piece ended, Polly's ears were burning. There was no mistaking it. This was a love song, naked and raw. The grim, shadowy beginning was his life before her. The light, harp-like melody in the middle, that was her. She suddenly remembered a boy in school who once tried to confess to her. He played guitar under her dorm window and sang her a song. She barely glanced out the window, popped in her earbuds, and kept reading. Her classmates later asked why she ignored such a romantic gesture. She didn't know back then. She just thought she wasn't into that kind of over-the-top display. But now she realized it wasn't about the gesture. It was about the music. That boy's guitar had been awful. But Erik? Every note made her body tingle. And this was an improvised piece. The realization hit her like a thunderclap, and the feeling only grew. Erik sat there, one hand propping up his forehead, eyes closed. He didn't dare look at her reaction. To him, composing music was as natural as writing. If she liked it, he could compose her a new song every single day, each in a different style. He just feared she wouldn't want to hear them. He knew, clear as day, that Polly loved him. No one in the world could love him like she did, not even himself. And yet, even now, with her trapped in this dark, underground nest, he couldn't help but ask, was she real? She accepted him completely. His darkness, his madness. She showed no resistance to this place. She even ate more than usual, an extra 50 grams of steak. She was so perfect, so precious, it felt like she could vanish at any moment. And she had disappeared once, for 3 years. Whenever that thought came up, he felt like everything around him was nothing more than a fleeting dream. A dream that could collapse at any second. That fear ate away at him. And the only thing that seemed to quiet it was the idea of fusing with her completely. If he hadn't known how exhausted she was after a month at sea, he might have acted already. He looked at her. His gaze was filthy, tainted with raw, pungent desire. Even while playing the organ, his longing for her had seeped into the keys, making the song twisted with passion. How could someone like him possibly deserve her love? Then, a warm sensation touched his lips. Polly had walked over, wrapped her arms around his neck, and kissed him. He froze for a moment, then gripped the back of her head, leaned down, and caught her tongue in his mouth. A soft, wet sound echoed. their breaths mixed, lips sliding together, everything sticky, clinging. Before he could follow his instinct and swallow again, she pulled her tongue back and pushed him away. With a small huff, she said, "There. Still overthinking?" Erik stared at her faintly glistening lips, voice hoarse. "What?" Polly gave his cheek a hard pinch. "You think I'm an idiot, don't you? As if I don't know organ stops control the volume. Oh, and here's a secret." She leaned in, whispering in his ear. "Not only do I know that, I also play piano. And I sing." With that, she gave his face another playful pinch and walked out of the music room with a laugh. Polly savored the stunned look on Erik's face as she took a long, relaxing bath. She had no idea how he did it, but despite the villa being built beside a lake, the interior wasn't damp or chilly at all. Even after 2 days of living there, her bedding remained crisp and dry. Unlike New Orleans, where during the rainy season the moisture seemed to soak through bricks and walls. You'd wake up in the morning, run a hand across your blanket, and feel water droplets clinging to the fabric. Fresh from the bath, Polly was toweling her hair dry as she stepped into the living room. Erik sat at the piano, head slightly bowed, staring at the black and white keys, lost in thought. He seemed to have bathed too. His white shirt clung to his side with water still soaking through. The collar hung open, revealing the deep ridges of his chest muscles and faint veins across his skin. Noticing her gaze, he instinctively turned his head to hide the disfigured half of his face. Polly loved that about him. Every time he avoided her gaze, she just wanted to walk up and kiss him. So she did. Walked straight over and kissed the scarred side of his face. "What are you thinking about?" she whispered, looping her arms around his neck. After that kiss, the tips of his ears, his cheeks, and even his chest muscles flushed slightly red, heat radiating faintly beneath his skin. Polly fluttered her lashes and leaned in again to kiss his neck. Suddenly, he reached out and caught her chin. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" he asked. She knew exactly what he meant but played dumb. "Tell you what? That you can sing," he said. "I'm not a pro," she replied with a smile. "Just did a few musical theater summer camps. You know, musicals are like light operas, less strict about vocals and more flexible in style. You've heard of African American brass band music, right? You'd never find that in traditional opera. But in musicals, anything goes." He stared at her for a long moment. "Like what?" Oddly, Polly felt a little shy. She wasn't usually the shy type. Performing in front of people never scared her. Apart from the first show, she was always relaxed and natural on stage. To her, performing was both a job and an escape. Only on stage did she feel like she didn't have to be herself. But since meeting Erik, she had become more willing to face herself, flaws, desires, and all. Even those bits of vanity most people avoided discussing. She liked who she was now. She didn't want to escape herself anymore. Still, the idea of performing in front of Erik made her nervous. His standards in music were terrifyingly high. What if he was disappointed when he heard her voice? Polly knew her own limits. If she were a vocal genius, she wouldn't have spent so many years stuck in ensemble roles. "Okay, but promise me first," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "No matter how I sing, you're not allowed to criticize me." Erik was quiet for a moment. "I won't." A song popped into her head, one that would be perfect to tease him with. Her eyes sparkled. "Then accompany me?" He nodded. He didn't ask for sheet music, didn't even need to hear the melody first. He was clearly planning to improvise. Damn it. How did he know she loved when he improvised? Polly closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, then opened them with a glint of mischief. "Sometimes I'm right, sometimes I'm wrong, but he doesn't care." The song was from the musical Chicago. The female lead had just killed her lover and was trying to get her husband to lie for her in court. At first, she thought she had him wrapped around her finger, delighting in his blind devotion. Every lyric dripped with syrupy sweetness, but the husband was too naive. He ended up blurting out the whole truth to the cops. The female lead flipped out, her sweet voice turning hysterical. Polly wondered if Erik could keep up with that shift while improvising. "Sometimes I'm down, sometimes I'm up," she sang, tilting her head to look at Erik. But he always follows like a sad little pup. Just 2 lines in, and he had already caught the rhythm. His left hand rolled out a few playful, cheeky notes on the keys. Polly raised an eyebrow, grinned, and settled onto his lap. She kissed his cheek and kept singing. "When the world says I'm no good, he's there for me, taking the fall." At that point, in the original show, the husband realized she had killed out of infidelity, unraveling her whole scheme. If it were a stage performance, the husband would now break into a furious monologue. But since Polly was alone, she exaggerated the emotions for effect. She suddenly pushed him back, and, feigning rage, sang, "Can't stand that idiot. If they hang me, I'll know who's holding the rope. My useless, terrible, stupid husband." The shift was abrupt, completely contrasting the earlier sweetness. But Erik didn't miss a beat. His accompaniment matched her vocals seamlessly, note for note, emotion for emotion. As the final note faded, Polly realized something: he could play jazz. Of course. He traveled so many places. He must have heard blues and brass band music firsthand. For a moment, she forgot all her nerves and blurted, "Well, how'd I do?" Erik shook his head. "That bad?" she asked, wide-eyed. "No," he said, as if the words were hard to form. Then he reached for her wrist, pulled her onto his lap, buried his head in the crook of her neck, and breathed deeply before answering, "I can't tell." Polly was stunned. She had braced for criticism. "Why not?" she asked. His voice was low, his breath brushing over her collarbone. "I don't know." The moment he realized it was her voice, he lost all ability to judge. Objectively, he knew there were flaws. Her breath control wasn't perfect, her tone was a little raspy, and her enunciation wasn't pure or full. But every word out of her mouth sent tingles down his spine. His fingers accompanied her from instinct alone. His brain had gone completely blank. Any other time, it would have been a disaster. Polly thought for a second and immediately got it. Her heart swelled with a sugary ache. She cupped his face, looked into his eyes, and said in amazement, "You like me that much?" The moment she saw his face, she froze. His eyes were glowing gold, intensely, frighteningly bright. His face was flushed red, and his eyes were bloodshot. Her singing had stirred him that much? This man was a musical genius, one of the greatest of all time. At least in this world, there was no one who matched his talent. Yet he had been utterly bewitched by her imperfect voice. It was absurd, and yet Polly couldn't help but feel incredibly pleased. She loved the way he was mesmerized by her. Immediately, a dozen very suggestive songs popped into her head. In the modern world, there was no shortage of sexy pop tunes. "If you like it that much," she said with a mischievous flutter of her lashes, "why don't I sing a few more for you?" Erik closed his eyes, took her hand, and pressed his face into her palm, exhaling slowly, as if giving up the fight. But Polly wasn't done. She lifted his chin, making him look at her. She had a particular fondness for sultry R&B with thick melodies and strong rhythm, perfect for teasing him. Logically, someone like him, with such refined musical taste, shouldn't react so strongly to modern pop. But his resistance was even weaker than she expected. In seconds, his ears were flushed red, veins bulging at his neck, and his Adam's apple bobbing violently. Polly loved that look. Just as she was about to sing another verse, Erik suddenly gripped her chin and yanked her forward. Bang! Her back hit the piano keys as he shoved her down. The piano let out a dissonant hum. Though she was on top somehow, he still felt overpowering, his gaze more dangerous than ever. His eyes were bloodshot, temples twitching, but his voice was eerily calm. "Keep singing." Polly swallowed hard, throat dry, and continued singing. Meanwhile, Erik placed his slender fingers on the keys and effortlessly replayed the melody she'd just sung. Playing piano demands control. Every finger must press with even strength, every wrist movement smooth and balanced. To master it, one must learn to command every ounce of finger pressure. That's how pianists control tone. Yes, most people didn't realize this, but piano tone could vary dramatically depending on touch. For the first time, Polly realized she could produce such layered, distinct tones, her voice weaving with the piano's deep hum into something strangely harmonious. Maybe she had teased him a bit too much, because now, his gaze was dangerously unhinged. As the music grew wild, he leaned in, still playing, grabbed her chin, stared into her dazed eyes, and murmured, "I didn't like that first song." Polly blinked. Huh? This man, at this moment, was actually dissecting the story. He lowered his voice and explained, "If you were the wife, and I the husband, even if you cheated, I wouldn't expose you to the police. I'd kill all the witnesses and cover it up with you. It was all lies." He made it sound like a calm, logical analysis. But as he spoke, the veins on the back of his hands bulged and the piano roared with manic intensity. The music was so fierce, Polly's mind started buzzing in rhythm with the keys. Finally, the piece ended, but barely 2 seconds later, the piano roared again. Another song. No rest. Only now did Polly grasp the true weight of Erik's obsession. He couldn't judge her voice, but he had exacting standards for every nuance of volume and emotion. If a note sounded off, he would try again and again and again, until it met his standards. She lost count of how many songs he played. He showcased nearly every technique, staccato, legato, everything. It reminded her of when she was little, practicing legato for hours. It looks simple, but true legato required pressing the fingers into the keys, like a delicate grind. Enough to drive anyone mad. She should have known. When you unleash 3 years' worth of repressed mastery and longing, it's terrifying. One thing was certain. She wasn't singing or playing again anytime soon. Around 3 or 4 in the morning, Polly was woken by a strange rustling sound. Still half asleep, she instinctively reached out with her leg, trying to hook it around Erik's. He was always warm, like a furnace, and sleeping next to him was the coziest thing in the world. But her leg landed on empty sheets. Her heart dropped instantly. She jolted awake, her first thought being, "I've gone back. Again." She sat up in panic, only calming down slightly when she saw the gas lamp on the nightstand. Just then, a hand reached out, gently cupping her chin. "Why are you awake?" Erik's voice asked softly. His fingers were cool, as if he'd just washed his hands and carried the faint scent of soap. Polly grabbed his wrist, pulled him closer so he bent toward her, their faces inches apart. "I thought I'd gone back again." Erik braced one hand beside her, his knee resting on the bed. "Are you that afraid of going back?" "No kidding." Polly gave him a light slap on the cheek. "Why do you think I came back in the first place?" Erik looked like he wanted to say something. She cut him off. "Don't talk. It's the middle of the night. I don't want to get mad." To her surprise, he really did fall silent. Polly chuckled and patted the spot beside her, motioning for him to sit. The mattress dipped as Erik sat down. Polly rested her head on his lap, fiddled with his fingers, and kissed his palm. "I don't think I've ever told you about my past." "Not that there's much to tell," she said, her voice muffled. "My parents were both successful, one a researcher, the other a college professor, but we were never close. In school, our language teacher made us write essays about our parents every week. I always made stuff up. The ironic part, no matter how fake it sounded. As long as I included their impressive titles, the teacher would give me an atlas and read it aloud as a model essay. Growing up, I always wondered if I was just too ordinary, too unremarkable for my parents to love." Erik paused for a moment, then threaded his fingers into her hair and gently combed through it, comforting her in silence. "When people are sad, their memories get fuzzy. Eventually, I learned to cope by immersing myself in fictional worlds. Books, movies, games, they were my escape. During that time, I hated everything about myself. Every time I looked in the mirror, all I saw were flaws. My personality wasn't particularly charming either. At every party, I was the one drinking juice alone in the corner. My acting career was going nowhere, and it felt like I'd never amount to anything." Erik seemed like he wanted to say something, but Polly kissed the back of his hand and shook her head. "No, you don't need to comfort me. That's all in the past. Back then, I truly hated myself. I wished I could be someone else. Anyone else, just not Polly." Strangely enough, it wasn't until she crossed into this world that she began to truly see herself. When Erik pressed a knife to her throat, it was as if she'd woken from a long nightmare. For the first time, she wanted to live. Every time she survived his threats, she felt a strange, indescribable sense of achievement. It was a process of survival, yes, but also one of self-acceptance. Only by confronting her flaws and shortcomings head-on could she learn to live better. When she tore off his mask, she was also tearing off her own. He had always hated his real face. So had she hated hers too, but not anymore. She was beginning to love her true self, even the weird and twisted parts. "I know what you're thinking," she said, looking up at him. "You're wondering if I really came here of my own free will, if I really fell in love with you, and whether I'll eventually leave." His hand, entwined with hers, suddenly tightened. No need to explain." She kissed his fingertips. "I just wanted to say, I love you, more than you could possibly imagine. It's because you're here that I'm afraid of going back." She wrapped her arms around his neck. He instinctively lowered his head. Their lips met. It was the gentlest kiss, completely free of lust or desire. Ever since learning she loved him, Erik hadn't had a single moment of peace. Every day he was gripped by a constant gnawing fear that she would one day wake up, come to her senses, and leave him. The terror of losing her haunted him day and night. Every night when he closed his eyes, he imagined her slipping away in her sleep. He had to keep them open, staring at her face until morning just to suppress the madness rising within him. Earlier that night, while watching her sleep as usual, he noticed something. Someone had broken into the lakeside mansion and was now locked in the torture chamber. What Polly didn't know was that Erik wasn't called a master architect for his artistic vision. It was because any house touched by his hand became a terrifying trap. Anyone who entered without permission would face unimaginable torment. Once he was sure Polly hadn't woken, Erik left the bedroom to investigate, only to see a familiar face. A man with a lambskin hat, dark skin, and eyes black as obsidian. Classic Persian features. Daroga? Erik frowned. What are you doing here? Daroga was someone he'd met in Persia. Back then, the king had grown wary of Erik's genius and ordered his execution. Daroga, the man assigned to carry it out, had taken pity on him, and instead handed him over to a circus manager to help him escape. That was how Erik had survived, and how everything afterward began. The moment Daroga laid eyes on Erik, a chill ran down his spine. So the rumors were true. Erik had really kidnapped a woman and brought her underground. Daroga remembered Erik as someone always impeccably dressed. Even in the blazing heat, he wore long sleeves, never showing an inch of skin. Now, he stood before him in a thin shirt, only 2 buttons done up, neck and chest covered in glaring red scratches. Clearly, the woman had fought back with everything she had. Daroga had never been close to Erik. He only saved him once because Erik had rescued him from a gang of thugs. At first, when he heard rumors about a ghost haunting the opera house, he didn't think of Erik. But when the newspaper published the details, the more he read, the more it felt like Erik, and he had rushed over to see for himself. As a former police chief, Daroga had no trouble finding the secret passage underground. He hadn't told anyone. The more people involved, the more would die. He had seen Erik kill before. Cold, swift, efficient. In Erik's hands, a rope became a saw, sharp enough to sever a man's head in seconds. Daroga didn't expect Erik to become a better man just because he'd once saved him. He only hoped Erik would let the kidnapped woman go, let her return to a normal life. To Daroga, Erik's recent public threat to blow up the opera house and die alongside the nobles was nothing more than a twisted way to lure the woman out. "I hope you realize," Daroga said in a low voice, "the entire city knows you've kidnapped someone. The nobles are searching for you everywhere. They won't find this place," Erik replied coolly. "But I did." They locked eyes, Erik looking down at him, his gaze laced with chilling malice. Daroga shivered and quickly added, "Just let her go, and I'll pretend none of this ever happened." "You know Polly?" Erik asked. "No." "Then why are you so eager for me to release her?" "Because I don't want innocent people getting hurt," Daroga said. "If I hadn't spared your life, you wouldn't have had the chance to imprison her like some criminal. I share some of the blame for that." Erik didn't feel like arguing. It was already 4 a.m. If this went on, they might wake Polly. But then, for some strange reason, he paused and coldly said, "I didn't kidnap her. She loves me." Daroga thought he was delusional. Who would fall in love with a man like him? A man with no status, no nation? A man who had openly declared he would blow up the opera house? "You expect me to believe that?" Daroga said, voice rising. "Even if she's fallen for you, it's not the real you. Does she know your past? Has she seen you kill? More importantly, has she seen your real face?" He said it on purpose. He was trying to provoke Erik. Only by doing so could he find the cracks in that terrifying mind. To his surprise, Erik's voice remained calm. "She knows my past. She's seen me kill. And she's seen my face." Daroga felt a wave of dread wash over him. This devil really was insane. If Erik ever realized that none of it was real, that she didn't love him, it would trigger something truly terrifying. Just then, Erik glanced at his watch. He seemed ready to leave. Daroga called out, "If you want me out of your business, fine. But let her go. If she comes back on her own, I'll believe she really loves you." From what he knew of Erik, if he had truly kidnapped her, he would release her and use hypnosis to bring her back, just to prove his dominance. But Erik's face suddenly twisted into something truly horrifying. "Daroga," he growled, "don't make me kill you." For the first time, Daroga saw a look on Erik's face so terrifying, it felt like he might commit a massacre on the spot. His heart nearly jumped into his throat. Cold sweat drenched his back. He only had one explanation now. That woman didn't love him. Not at all. Maybe she even hated him. Enough that hypnosis no longer worked. After returning from seeing Daroga, Erik was still consumed by a simmering urge to kill. When he returned to the bedroom and saw Polly awake, a ridiculous thought popped into his head. What if Daroga was a messenger sent by Polly to help her escape? He knew it was impossible. Polly would never do that. But he couldn't suppress the dark, venomous voice in his mind. Was she really here by choice? Did she really love him? What he didn't know was, she already knew all his twisted, paranoid thoughts. She lay on his lap, her voice soft and steady, bearing her past with heartbreaking honesty, laying all her confusion and fear at his feet, just so he would believe she loved him. Erik closed his eyes. The murderous rage disappeared in an instant. For the first time, he truly felt what it meant to be loved. More comforting than sunshine in November. After their kiss, he pressed his nose to the side of her neck, breathing in her scent until his chest tingled. It felt like every moment of loneliness and suffering in his life had been healed by her words. But after relief came an even more intense craving. Just like a wound that heals, it might form new skin, but then comes the unbearable itch. Polly had no idea. Her words didn't heal his twisted obsession. They only made him crave her even more. Like a man deep in addiction, sinking further with no way out. The lakeside residence wasn't entirely cut off from the world. Every 2 or 3 days, someone would send supplies down from the surface using an elevator-like mechanism. Erik never told her who delivered the goods. And Polly never asked. Whoever it was, it clearly wasn't anyone important. There was no way Erik would let circus folk anywhere near this place. Sometimes he also went up to the surface to buy things himself. This week, Polly witnessed his entire process of making new clothes, from selecting fabrics, drawing patterns, cutting materials, to threading the needle and sewing by hand. She had to admit, watching him measure her with a soft tape, bending slightly to sketch patterns on paper, it was an incredibly enjoyable sight. Especially with his sleeves rolled up to the elbows, revealing firm, proportionate forearms, faint blue veins running beneath the surface. There was something aggressively attractive about it. And yet, those refined, articulate hands were sewing clothes for her. Polly was completely helpless against this contrast. The feeling was mutual. He made clothes for her, and she wanted to dress him up in return. Unfortunately, she didn't know the first thing about tailoring, couldn't even do basic cross-stitch, so all she could do was write a list of fabrics and ask him to buy them. He would then make clothes for himself. When Erik saw the list, he paused and said, "I already have enough clothes." Polly replied righteously, "I want to see you in something new." He let out a low chuckle. "Sounds like you just want to keep me busy." It was the first time he smiled without a hint of sarcasm. Polly looked at his side profile, her heart thumping twice in quick succession. She couldn't help but lean in and kiss the corner of his lips. Erik looked at her, confused. Polly blinked playfully. "I'm starting to really like your face." For a brief moment, Erik had the urge to take her to Daroga, just to show him what had just happened. But it passed in a second. Her love deserved to be cherished and protected, not shown off like some freak display for others to gawk at. Though, he did really want Daroga to know she loved him. Daroga had been a witness to the first half of his life. He knew better than anyone how ugly, terrifying, and repulsive Erik once was. How could someone who had been dirt poor his whole life resist showing off the priceless treasure he had suddenly obtained? Just the thought of their relationship being made public, of the whole world knowing Polly was his wife, made his chest tighten with excitement. He had to take deep breaths just to stay calm. He had to suppress the urge to flaunt her. Only a hunter boasts about his prey. But between them, the dynamic of hunter and hunted had long since ended. Polly had no idea what Erik was thinking, or that there was now someone else in the lakeside villa. Ever since Erik began tailoring for himself, she had become obsessed with styling him. He always wore black coats. Sure, black was foolproof on most men and looked great on him, but still, she wished he could wear something lighter, less heavy in tone. So she had him bring back deep brown, light gray, and pure white cashmere fabrics from the surface. His old clothes were all off the rack and fairly generic in cut. The only reason he looked so striking in them was because of his exceptional proportions. But now that he was making clothes by hand, they were bound to fit far better. To ensure he didn't slack off, Polly supervised the entire process, making sure he followed his own measurements down to the centimeter, height, shoulder width, waistline. The final result? Absolutely stunning. He looked amazing in a long, deep brown coat. Especially the clean-cut sides. It tapered inwards subtly, just enough to emphasize the near-perfect contour of his waist and abdomen. Polly stared at him, admiring his silhouette for a while, then couldn't resist reaching out to touch the muscles along his side. Aside from his brain, that was the second sexiest part of him. Lots of people admired abs, but the real showstopper was those interwoven side muscles, that tight, angular anatomy that could scramble a person's brain. Every time he undressed in front of her, facing sideways, she had to fight the urge to push him onto the bed. Unfortunately, she was on her period. Polly withdrew her hand with great regret. She had been lamenting the luggage she left at the hotel, but to her surprise, Erik had managed to recreate a functional disposable pad based on just a few of her vague descriptions. Once again, she was floored by how smart he was. After the initial shock, she immediately urged him to apply for a patent. If war ever broke out, this super absorbent material could be used for medical bandages and sold worldwide. The royalties alone would be enough for them to live in luxury for the rest of their lives. Still, if possible, Polly hoped they wouldn't have to live through a war. She wondered, since Tesla had figured out how to use electromagnetic fields to keep her from returning, could she ask him to find a path between past and future, so she and Erik could return to the modern world together? If she could bring Erik with her, that would be the best. If not, she'd stay here forever. That was fine too. The only problem was, Erik's mental state still hadn't fully stabilized. She decided to wait a while before bringing it up. Polly had patience. She loved everything about him, including his oversensitive heart. Taming a beast was only the beginning of their relationship. Helping him adapt to a warm, safe life, one that didn't rely on violence for survival, that was the true endgame. He had almost completely changed for her, and she had enough patience to wait for him to return to a normal life. Even if he could never become a normal person, that was fine. She hadn't fallen in love with him because he was normal. Meanwhile, Daroga was on the verge of losing his mind in the torture chamber. He hadn't exchanged a single word with Erik for an entire week. Erik only showed up at set times to deliver meals and ask if he wanted to leave. Daroga always replied no, thinking it would prompt Erik to stay and talk. After all, he was probably the only person in the entire villa still willing to speak to this demon. But every time, Erik just turned and left without a word, clearly uninterested in conversation. At first, Daroga was confused, but then he remembered, Erik was never much of a talker. What really made him anxious was that, after all this time, he still hadn't gotten a glimpse of the woman Erik had supposedly kidnapped. In Daroga's mind, the woman was probably already disfigured from abuse. Even if Erik hadn't touched her, just showing his real face would have caused immense trauma. Speaking of his face, that was the part Daroga couldn't understand. Before this, Erik had been pathologically secretive about his appearance. Anyone who tried to remove his mask was tortured to death in horrific ways. But lately, Erik sometimes forgot to wear his mask altogether. Daroga had caught glimpses of his mutilated face, and when Erik realized he wasn't wearing the mask, he didn't react violently. In fact, he barely showed any emotion at all, just calmly set down the tray and walked away. What on earth had happened to make such a hideous, self-loathing monster voluntarily take off his mask? Daroga was completely baffled. Some time passed, and Daroga finally figured out Erik's routine. Every 2 days he would go up to the surface to buy things. For some reason, the devil had recently taken a strong interest in dressing himself up. His clothes hardly ever repeated. The more Daroga thought about it, the more uneasy he felt. Every change in Erik filled him with dread. In Persia, Erik had been both a god and a monster, omnipotent and utterly depraved. No one knew how he came to possess such vast knowledge. He was terrifyingly well-read, dabbling in even the most obscure fields. If that were all, he'd simply be a genius. But what made him truly frightening was his never-ending array of ways to kill. Daroga even suspected the infamous torture chamber wasn't built by royal order, but because Erik enjoyed killing. Back at the Mazandaran palace, Erik never executed death row prisoners right away. Instead, he'd let them escape first, watch them hide, think they were safe, and then track them down, one by one, and hang them. He had extraordinary intelligence, a cold and ruthless heart, and delighted in the hunt. To him, human lives were as worthless as grass. What else could he be, if not a devil? Daroga was a man of excessive compassion. Ever since he had let Erik go, he often woke up from nightmares, terrified that Erik might be doing something horrible to others. Every time something bad happened, or someone died, his first thought was always, could Erik be behind this? If he couldn't save the woman Erik had allegedly abducted, he would never forgive himself. He had unleashed this monster. Now someone else was paying the price. One day, when Erik was out shopping, Daroga began shouting at the top of his lungs from inside the torture chamber, "Help! Somebody help!" Unfortunately, the room was soundproof. No matter how loud he screamed, nothing got out. He also considered throwing something, but the chamber was sealed so tightly, it was like an iron barrel, completely airtight. Even after saving up some porcelain spoons, he couldn't get a single one through. What Daroga never expected was that it wouldn't be Erik who came, but the woman. Polly had been bored lately and had explored nearly every inch of the lakeside villa. What surprised her most was discovering that Erik had been keeping Caesar, the ornery Arabian white horse from the circus. 3 years had passed, and Caesar's bad temper hadn't mellowed one bit. The moment he saw her, he bared his teeth like a spoiled dog. She seriously wanted to slap him. Without hesitation, she put on Erik's coat and returned. Sure enough, Caesar behaved, burying his head in the grass, pretending nothing had happened. Aside from the stable, Polly also found a hidden storage room, filled entirely with her belongings. The dresses she had worn, the hats she'd tried on, the saddle she'd ridden, the tableware she used, even a book she'd flipped through twice. So the closet in New Orleans had only been full of replicas. Polly blinked slowly, eyelashes fluttering. She couldn't help imagining what Erik had done with all these things. Even if he hadn't done anything, she wanted to watch him do something filthy with them. Too bad Erik wasn't back from the surface yet. She could only imagine it in her head. Then a question popped into her mind. Where was the torture chamber in the original novel? Erik would never let her explore it herself, so she had to find it on her own. Luckily, Erik must have forgotten. Long ago, he had once told her in great detail how the torture chamber was constructed. She didn't know whether he was trying to scare her or had seen through her dark fascination, but he'd whispered every detail in her ear. The mechanisms, the executions, the traps. For Erik, that had been 3 years ago. For Polly, only 2 months had passed. It was still fresh in her mind. She had no trouble remembering how to open the entrance. And so she knocked and tapped her way through the corridors, and actually found it. When the trapdoor creaked open, Polly jumped in shock. Someone was inside. She stared at him for a few seconds and quickly guessed who it was, the Persian from the original story. In the novel, he had been a noble character. He had once saved Erik from the king's executioners, and since then had followed his tracks, trying to save his victims. Without his help, Christine and Raoul would never have had a happy ending. Polly thought for a moment and immediately guessed why Daroga was locked here. He probably thought she had been kidnapped and was trying to rescue her, which had landed him in the torture chamber. She hesitated, then said, "Daroga?" Daroga was stunned. "You know me?" He didn't have time to question how she knew his old title. Daroga meant police chief in Persia. He stepped forward and grabbed her wrist. "No matter how you found this place, we have to get out of here. That devil will be back any minute." Polly looked down at his hand on hers. The whole situation felt like triggering a game plot point, uncanny and surreal. She didn't pull away and instead asked, "Are you here to save me?" Daroga was baffled as they walked. "He talked to you about me? That's strange. I thought he'd want to bury all those memories." Polly tilted her head. "What memories?" Daroga ran around like a headless chicken for a while before realizing they were going in circles. He stopped and turned to her. "Did he ever tell you he used to work for the Persian king?" He asked this to expose Erik's lies. If Polly said no, he would reveal everything immediately. But Polly nodded. "He told me..." Daroga choked on air. "Did he also tell you that his greatest skill isn't magic or music or architecture, but killing?" Polly replied sincerely, "Yes, that too." Daroga couldn't believe it. "He really told you all that? Have you seen his face under the mask?" Polly stifled a laugh. "He rarely wears it when we're together." "Why?" Daroga was speechless. If Erik had said all this himself, Daroga would have assumed he'd gone mad. But Polly's eyes were clear, her expression calm, even smiling faintly. She didn't look insane in the slightest. Had Erik's hypnosis become that advanced? Or had this woman really fallen in love with the devil? If it were just hypnosis, Erik could have used it on Daroga too. There'd be no need to keep him locked up. At this point, Daroga had no choice but to believe him. Maybe Erik really hadn't kidnapped her. He let go of Polly's wrist and took a step back, studying her carefully. She wore a long white silk dress with delicate ripples, tied at the waist with a pale green ribbon, like the first sprout of spring on a snowy mountain peak. Her face was fresh and elegant. Her hands were particularly beautiful, soft, rounded knuckles, clean pink nails, porcelain, white skin like a fine vase. Only someone who had never been abused could have such hands. And then Daroga noticed something else. There was a subtle hint of amusement in her gaze, as if she were teasing him. He muttered, "You really haven't been hypnotized by Erik?" It was just too bizarre. Such a stunning woman. Actually loved that grotesque, terrifying monster. And the most unbelievable part? She had seen his real face. Even his own parents couldn't bear to look at him. Yet she lived with that face daily and wasn't afraid. Daroga couldn't even imagine the scene. This wasn't Beauty and the Beast. It was Beauty and the Skull. Still unconvinced, he asked, "You're really with him? Voluntarily?" Polly thought for a moment and said, "It's not something I can explain in a few words. Why don't you stay for lunch?" Daroga nearly collapsed on the spot. She had opened the torture chamber without Erik's permission, let him out, and now wanted him to have lunch with them? Even if Erik was madly in love with her, seeing her free a prisoner from the torture chamber would definitely enrage him. He might threaten to blow up the opera house again. Daroga was about to plead with her when, click, the front door of the lakeside villa opened. Erik had returned. For a second, it felt like Daroga had swallowed a cold, wet rag. His stomach sank like a stone. Fear poured down his spine like ice water. He trembled, teeth chattering, every hair on his body standing on end. The atmosphere froze. Footsteps echoed through the corridor. And then Erik appeared. He wore a deep gray coat that fell to his knees, a white shirt underneath, black leather gloves on his hands. At the sight of Daroga, he paused for a few seconds, then he slowly peeled off the gloves, revealing slender, sharp-knuckled fingers. The gloves were thin but strong. As he pulled them off, they tightened across his joints, sharp folds flashing like cold steel, radiating a murderous aura. "Daroga," Erik said calmly, "why are you here?" Daroga's heart pounded. He was about to take all the blame upon himself when Polly stepped forward, took Erik's hand, and kissed his fingers. "I let him out." Erik looked down at her. Daroga's heart turned cold. That look in Erik's eyes was anything but gentle. It felt like he might slice her throat the next second. But Polly wasn't scared at all. She reached up and pinched his cheek lightly. "Got a problem with that?" Several seconds passed. Then Erik lowered his head, buried his nose against her neck, and took a deep breath, like a man conceding. No. To Daroga, it was a surreal and eerie sight. Erik was far too tall, uncomfortably so. And yet here he was, resting against Polly's neck like a dependent child, as if utterly devoted to her. She patted his back and smiled. "Then go make lunch." Erik raised his head and looked at Daroga again. Daroga's neck bristled with fear. Even if someone paid him 100 gold pieces, he wouldn't eat Erik's cooking. Back in the torture chamber, Erik had only ever fed him bread and potatoes. Worse than prison food. He stammered, "Why you two eat? I'm not hungry." Erik didn't make him lunch anyway. For lunch, they had langoustines and prawns. To suit Polly's taste, Erik didn't serve them raw French style. Instead, he shelled the shrimp, sliced them in half, brushed them with butter, seasoned with pepper and thyme, grilled them over coals, and finished with a squeeze of lemon. Daroga never imagined Erik would one day prepare a meal so delicately for a woman. It wasn't that Polly didn't deserve it, but Erik had always seen both men and women as livestock to be slaughtered. His hands were meant for killing. His knives were meant for killing. And now, he was using them to cook? Daroga felt like he was in a dream. A ridiculous, upside-down dream. But the most absurd part wasn't even Erik cooking. Polly had eaten too much in the morning, plus an espresso, and had little appetite. After a few bites, she pushed the rest of her shrimp over to Erik. Erik seemed used to eating her leftovers. He finished them without a word. Polly rested her cheek on her hand, watching him eat. After a while, she leaned in and ate a piece of shrimp straight from his fork. Erik looked at her. Polly said, "You look so good, I got hungry." Daroga. He could not, for the life of him, understand how the words appetizing and Erik could be used in the same sentence. Erik lowered his gaze, said nothing, but his breath quickened and the tips of his ears flushed faintly red. Polly resisted the urge to kiss him, only because Daroga was present. After lunch, Erik cleared the dishes and went to the kitchen to wash up, and Daroga finally understood why Polly's hands were so well taken care of. Polly turned to him and smiled. "So, do you believe we're married now?" As unbelievable as it was, Daroga had no choice but to believe it. If they weren't truly in love, how could Polly be this close to such a monstrous man? Daroga said with a complicated expression, "Satman, he's really hit the jackpot, meeting you." Polly smiled and shook her head. No, I'm the lucky one." She meant it. Out of all the horror stories she could have landed in, Erik was the only one who could communicate, barely, and who just so happened to match all her dark little preferences. If she'd opened Saw that day instead of Phantom of the Opera, now that would have been a disaster. Daroga couldn't comprehend what was so lucky about encountering Erik. Surviving him was hard enough. From his point of view, Erik had definitely hit the jackpot. He thought back to those days in the Mazandaran palace. Back then, Erik had been a completely untamed beast, driven purely by hunting instincts. Even after Daroga had saved him, Erik had shown zero gratitude. He looked at Daroga the way a wild animal looks at a trap, resentful, vengeful. Now though, there was a trace of humanity in his eyes, but only when he looked at Polly. Daroga sighed. Well, it was better than nothing. At least now he didn't have to flinch every time there was a murder in the papers, wondering if Erik was responsible again. With Polly by his side, maybe Erik could become a good man. Just then, Erik walked out of the kitchen. Daroga almost choked on his own saliva. Erik had removed his mask and dark coat. He was wearing only a white shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing strong, damp forearms. He was calmly drying his hands. The Persian king had grown wary of Erik precisely because no one, not even royalty, could control him. At first, the king treated Erik like a confidant, letting him redesign the palace and bestowing upon him great status and wealth. But soon the king realized he couldn't control Erik at all, not even enough to order him to remove his mask. Erik had always been a strange genius, with a grotesque imagination. He could master new skills within days. Such a man, if he couldn't be controlled, had to be destroyed. And yet Polly had made him willingly remove his mask, take off his gloves and coat, and reveal that pale skin hidden from the world for so long. If he hadn't seen it with his own eyes, Daroga never would have believed that this gentle-looking man was Erik. Without so much as a glance at Daroga, Erik put down the towel, walked over to Polly, leaned slightly over her with one hand braced beside her, and kissed the curve of her ear. Then he gently tucked a stray strand of her hair behind it. Polly tilted her head up to look at him. He sat down next to her as if nothing had happened and casually asked, "And you've been living here for a while? Want to go somewhere else for a change?" Polly blinked. "Why?" "New place to live," he replied lightly. "'Cause place is too damp. No sunlight, not good for your health." "Maybe later," Polly said, clearly reluctant. "I don't want to move just yet, but I wouldn't mind going out for a trip." Daroga realized then why Polly could tame the beast. He thought Erik had finally changed, that he wanted to leave this dark lair for Polly's sake, but she saw right through his motive at once. Erik frowned slightly. "Oh, why don't you want to move?" Daroga braced himself for a sweet, reassuring answer from Polly. But instead, she replied confidently, "Because I'm lazy. Too lazy to find a new place, buy furniture, decorate. If you handle all that and then ask me to move, of course I'll say yes." Daroga. "Okay, I'm clearly overthinking everything." Erik paused, then said, "Yeah, I'll ask again once I've prepared everything." Polly nodded. "Sure." Daroga figured there was no need for him to stay any longer. Erik had truly found someone he could spend his life with. Polly knew everything about him, his terrifying past, his ghastly face, and she still loved him. Daroga's only hope now was that they'd never break up, because if they did, Erik would definitely go mad and slaughter everyone. Before leaving, Daroga looked at Erik and sighed, "And try to be a good man. Keep a low profile. Don't let the Tehran government know you're still alive or I won't get my pension. Erik didn't respond. Daroga was used to his silence. Just as he was about to nag a bit more, he suddenly remembered something and turned to Polly. Young lady, if you ever run into trouble, come find me. I live in Paris. Daroga. Erik finally spoke, his voice low and cold, clearly a warning. All right, Daroga shivered. I get it, she's your treasure. You don't have to be so possessive. I wasn't trying anything, just offering help. Fine. I'll go. After Daroga left, the villa by the lake returned to its usual stillness. The dining room was dimly lit. Erik turned and walked toward her. Even after living together for so long, when his presence enveloped her like that, Polly still felt an indescribable sense of invasion, as if even his breath carried a magnetic pull, a primal force that pressed up against her. Only he could give her this feeling, which is why she was lucky. To find someone who truly, completely loves you, that's rare enough. But to find someone who fits your twisted preferences too? If that's not luck, what is? Erik stood before her and slowly knelt down. He reached into his pocket and took out a small velvet box. Polly blinked. He looked into her eyes. This is the wedding ring you once gave me. I took it from the body. I've kept it with me ever since. Polly's breath hitched. Her heart felt like it had just been struck hard. She'd never been someone who placed much meaning in objects. Lose a ring? Just buy another. But Erik wasn't like her. He kept everything she ever touched, even the house she'd once lived in. If she'd never returned to the 19th century, the New Orleans villa would have stood forever, with her name and the mysterious merchants etched on the brass plate by the garden gate. He looked powerful and terrifying on the outside, but on the inside, he was deeply sensitive. And, like she'd said before, she loved all of him. No matter how sensitive he was, she still loved him. She reached out her hand. So, will you put it back on me? Before I do, he said, I want to say something. Polly tilted her head, curious. Go ahead. He looked at her and said his first sentence, You know I'm a despicable man. Polly was stunned. If Daroga hadn't shown up, I was planning to keep you locked here for the rest of your life, he said. Well, maybe not for life. I'd probably cave when you begged and let you return to the surface. But at the start, that was my plan. He closed his eyes. My love isn't noble. On the contrary, it's shameful. When Daroga doubted we were truly married, I even thought about parading you in front of him. I wanted him to know I had a wife like you, but he hadn't needed to. Polly had fulfilled that secret wish without even knowing. The moment he saw the look of shock in Daroga's eyes, he was so thrilled his scalp tingled, his fingers trembled. He nearly snapped the silver cutlery in his hand. Daroga had always called him a savage beast. Maybe he was. Only beasts felt the need to assert dominance and show off their mates. But Polly wasn't a beast. She deserved better. More human love. She shouldn't live in this cold, damp place. She should have a warm, comfortable home. And yet, even now, dark thoughts still haunted him. Every time she exposed her delicate neck to him, he wanted, desperately, to bite down and crush her throat. Violent, cruel thoughts he couldn't shake. Even holding her wrist made him tremble with an urge to squeeze harder, to hear her bones crack under pressure. He was ashamed of his instincts. But he wasn't saying all this to drive her away. Of course not. By now, she knew him too well. And he knew her just as well. What he really wanted was her affirmation. For over a decade, no one had loved him, seen him, or listened to him. But Polly would love him. Polly would see him. Polly would listen. He had never been confident. Even with her love, he lived in constant fear, unable to sleep peacefully. Every hour or two, he'd wake up just to check if she was still there. But slowly, he was starting to believe. Polly truly loved him. And in his barren life, that was the one thing he could be sure of. Polly tilted her head at him. She was sitting in a chair, looking down from above. But her gaze was warm and soft, never condescending. You already know what I'm going to say, she said gently. I love you. Even the ugly parts. And you said showing me off to Daroga was shameful. But I don't think so. Erik froze and looked up at her. And because I wanted to show you off too, she said. How can that be shameful? It's human. If you hid me or acted like we weren't together, that would have been shameful. Erik closed his eyes, lowered his head, and pressed his nose to the back of her hand. His breath came hot and fast. Yes, she would always love him most. Polly lightly patted his cheek. "Well, put it on me." He sat upright and slipped the pure gold wedding band onto her ring finger. Under the candlelight, it shimmered with a soft, golden glow. Erik stared at it for a moment. Then he bowed his head and kissed her fingertip, her knuckle, her palm. Then gripped her shoulders and gently pushed her down, covering her lips with his. They kissed, lips and tongues entwined, breathing each other in. Polly murmured between kisses, "And you haven't said I love you yet." "I love you," he whispered, his breath scorching. A month later, Polly moved out of the lakeside villa. Her mind was blank, her hands idle, as she watched Erik choose a new house, plan the layout, and organize the move. At one point, she tugged him into the storage room and made him demonstrate how he used to miss her using all the items in there. The result? The air became so thick and heated, everything was left dirty beyond repair and had to be thrown out. Even 2 days later, Polly still felt sore, like she'd been hollowed out. She also felt like something might still be leaking when she walked. The new house was tentatively in New York. Polly couldn't resist the temptation any longer. She wanted to witness the War of Currents herself, and return the patent to Harvey Hubble to correct the historical timeline. She used to think she had no interest in travel. Turns out, with Erik by her side, she was curious about everything. Even the farthest landscape seemed worth visiting. They lived in New York for a while. During that time, Polly contacted the circus to let them know she was safe and met with Tesla. Just like the story said, Tesla was reserved, heavily accented, and stared at his food while speaking stiffly. Polly noticed he wasn't fond of face-to-face conversation, so she resumed writing him letters, which earned her a cold stare from Erik every time. A few months later, they left New York for London. Polly hoped to catch a glimpse of Sherlock Holmes. But perhaps because this world was a horror story, Holmes didn't exist, and she left disappointed. After London, they traveled to Florence and even reached as far as Gallerhorn Peak in Denmark. In the 19th century, travel was painfully slow, but because of that, they could savor every sight, never missing a single beautiful view. After returning from Denmark, they held a wedding in a Florentine cathedral. During the ceremony, Erik stared only at her. In front of the priest, he removed his white mask and sang the wedding mass he'd composed himself. Above them, on the vaulted ceiling, divine paintings stretched toward the heavens. But in Polly's eyes, she saw only Erik, cold, flawed, and entirely hers. If you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Nuevi Story. Thanks for listening.